I'm Joe Mullings. Today we're sitting with Dean Schauer of Confluent, the CEO. Steve, Dean, good to see you.
My pleasure, guys. Thank you.
Yeah, it's good to have you on with Joe and I and Dragonfly, and we look forward to our conversation about nitinol supply chain.
That's not something you generally hear, but I'm delighted to be here, actually.
Yeah.
So thanks for taking the time, guys.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Steve, would you lead us into the topic at hand, my friend?
You know, such a novel material like nitinol used in all these more modern applications, electrophysiology, structural heart, neurovascular, super elastic capability, shape memory. Talk to us first before we get into some of those challenges on supply chain about the vertically integrated nitinol capabilities at Confluent.
Sure. Yeah. So Confluent, as you know, we have three basic material science platforms that make up our company. There's polymers, which we do a lot of work in polymers for catheters and other things, introducers and things like that. We also have a very nice capability in implantable textiles, fabrics, and other materials that are less metal based, obviously. And then our largest platform is our material science expertise around nitinol. And we've been at it, I mean, well before I started. Shockingly, my 11th anniversary at NDC now. Confluent came up 2 days ago, which is hard to imagine, by the way. But NDC, Confluent's fundamentals started back in the mid 90s, actually. So it's been around a while, and the material itself has been around. So we built out our business around nitinol from, as you know, from melting all the way through finished device and production. We offer services, materials, and capabilities to the industry at whole, as well as using them ourselves. And it really, starts from the time that nickel and titanium show up at our melt source in the Northeast. We can handle it all the way through production into a device and/or provide services anywhere along that supply chain continuum. So the exciting part for us is, we're not making coat hangers, which, have their own market, not to be disparaging, but the stuff we make, the stuff we get involved in is exciting because it truly is either life-saving, life-preserving, or life-enhancing materials. So I tell folks a lot, it's a pretty exciting thing to tell your family or loved ones. That's what you get to do every day, is to make stuff that keeps people alive, or at least enhances their ability to stay alive. So
The interesting thing, you mentioned it here. Certainly anybody in device knows the importance of nitinol and all of the products are put out, but nitinol represents, the medtech nitinol represents a very small part to the rest of the world, what's being used in nitinol. And we almost are, I would say a very small percentage of global use. However, your organization spotted a liability in that not too long ago. And I'm saying it, you're not necessarily saying it, but it was so important to the industry of what you did there. And some people misinterpret it. I had heard from other players, it was misinterpreted as a land grab, and I would go the other way. So let's chat about that a little bit. Take us through that history.
Andrew, I appreciate it. So I'm gonna take you back a little bit if you don't mind. But just to give you some idea, there's about roughly 300,000 pounds of nitinol melting capacity available in the industry, roughly, plus or minus. A few years ago, that capacity got significantly reduced down closer to maybe 200,000 at best, maybe a little less than that. And that's when I think people took notice. Fortunately, we'd already taken some notice of that before. But it's not only on the melting side, it's in the whole supply chain that we identified some risks, actually, and some concerns up to about 8 years ago, actually. And what I mean by that is that, and I'll be very open with you all, we've been contacted by our melt supplier back in 2014, 2015, and said the size of the capacity you need for your specialty premium materials, it's not worth it to us anymore. We're just not going to do that for y'all. Now, we had some very large customers who had process of clinically qualifying their devices using that grade of nitinol. So it was like, man, you can imagine the flight home after that meeting was a little troubling. But at that moment, we said, okay, fair enough. We can either accept it or we can find a solution for it. And thankfully, we were able to work with our supplier to put in capacity. We actually invested in capacity at that time, about 2015, 16. We put a little over $3 million into their facility to ensure that the premium grade nitinol could be melted and continue production. And that was somewhat invisible, but very important step that we took. On the flight home that day, I pulled out a napkin, honestly, and a piece of paper and said, my goodness, this is a surprise to us that they were willing to do that. And we actually mapped out the supply chain risks all along the way. People talk about nitinol in a bucket. Or melting, I'm sorry, in a bucket. There are significant steps that go into melting. There's significant steps post-melting for conditioning, bar production, gun drilling, tube drawing, grinding along that converting the ingot into a billet into a bar. I mean, there's a lot of unit operations that people sometimes will mistake for melting, as an example. So when we identified that risk and other risks, we started to immediately attack those areas and bring it into a strategy of how do we stabilize supply for the market. I do want to touch on something you did say, Joe, and I want to make sure I addressed it properly, is that our melt supplier is a very large global conglomerate materials company, and they melt roughly about 2 billion pounds of metal a year. That's one supplier of materials that is used for nitinol, of the two that are primarily available. Of the 2 billion pounds that they potentially melt across their continuum, you can imagine 150,000 pounds is what goes into medical grade nitinol. So to your point, it's a very small fraction, not only of the nitinol used globally, but of the melt capacity that's necessary globally. It's unfortunately rounding error if you think about it in terms of volume. So immediate risk identified by saying, my God, are we meaningful enough to the melter and to the market of that size to be considered important enough for them to continue to support that business? So that was step one. And then step two, as I mentioned, we went through the whole continuum and found other areas that were of concern that we felt we needed to shore up. So.
Yeah, and if you pull on that string, that gets really scary because you start with the large strategics. And again, patient first always. And that's why I think we all choose this industry. It's the patient. But when you start to think about the infrastructure that nitinol brings to devices, from implants to delivery mechanisms and all the other things I don't even know that you could probably line out, I can't believe that even the large strategics at 30 billion a year in sales had not identified that as a gap ultimately and how that would impact their products and the patients that it hits.
Yeah, I mean, fair point. I obviously don't want to speak for them, but I can tell you it's become apparent that was not necessarily on their radar, right? They were thinking about it in terms of, I can get a drawn wire, or I can get a drawn tube, or maybe a laser cut, as cut piece, or I can get the ultimate component from somebody. And that's kind of where the supply chain in their minds may have gone, right? I think until recently, we've tried very hard to educate folks that, we kind of joke in a good way, that the tube doesn't grow on a tree. It comes from a bar, which has to have been ground, which has to have been gun drilled, which has to have been right conditioned, that had to come from an ingot and a billet. And there's multiple unit operational steps to get to that place. And if you don't take your sort of supply chain point of view past the first step in your receipt, that's when I think you can be surprised. And I think a lot of folks, unfortunately, were surprised, which kind of gets into, thankfully, I don't want to say we were surprised. We were surprised once. I'll say that. We were surprised back in 2015 when they told us they were going to melt that small fragment of our high purity materials. But that was a bit of a, I don't want to say fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. We are not going to let that happen. That's when we set out our strategy, not to take over a supply chain by any stretch. What we wanted to do is make sure we had a stabilized supply chain for our company's future, our customers' future, the patients they support, and then ultimately the industry itself, who relies on a lot of the products and services that the melt sources provide. So,
what were some of the misinterpretations in the industry of your so-called peers? I don't even want to call them competitors, but what were some of the sort of misinterpretations there?
Well, and I actually appreciate the comment. They are peers of ours. I mean, we consider a lot of the folks in our space that do a lot of the same things we do as colleagues and as peers, not as, they are ultimately competitors, and there's no question. But if you get right down to it, I mean, we all have to be in a good spot for the ultimate customers to succeed. But I think it didn't actually come back from the melting activity we did. It came when we identified one of the key operations was gun drilling, which I would be willing to bet, just sort of jokingly, that 8 years ago or 10 years ago, if you'd have gone to any of the large OEMs and asked them how key the gun drilling capabilities in their supply chain were, I'm not sure any of them would have even known what you were talking about. But what's interesting is the gun drilling source that we ended up acquiring, I think our estimates were, please don't audit my numbers, by the way, but roughly 80% of the implantable materials that went into stents, heart valves, et cetera, passed through their gun drillers. Wow. It was a $5 million business run by two guys.
I was going to say the mom and pop or the brothers, right? Two people that when they didn't want to work on Saturdays, they just didn't work on Saturdays.
Yeah. Thankfully, these are two amazing gentlemen who created an incredible business and would have worked Saturdays, Sundays, or Christmases, but that's not normal, right? And what we identified is all of our all of our gun drilling hollows went through them. So our reaction was, great group, great company, wonderful people, had done a great job. It was like, man, if we don't secure that, and somebody realizes the value that business has outside the medical device space and grabs it, we're all at their mercy, all of us. And our company would have, I mean, we would have been completely dependent upon their willingness to serve us. So we said, you know what, that's a risk. And we went in and thankfully negotiated a very nice deal with them to acquire that capability for stability, security, and the ability to scale it, right? I mean, it was literally a $5 million revenue company. So you can imagine their capital constraints and their financial constraints that may have been in place. So thankfully we were able to do that. Coming back to your question about how was it misinterpreted, the reaction was that we bought that so we could monopolize that incredibly key capability. I joke with our team, you know, in a good way, guys. At the MD&M show in Anaheim, we get a lot of people into our booth. The minute the announcement came out that we had acquired Tube Hollows in Maine, you couldn't get into our booth. I felt like sort of Shrek on the, you know, locking himself in the castle, and people were banging on the door with torches and pitchforks asking us why we had done that. And I said, guys, the reason we did it is the exact same reason you're standing in our booth today, is because if someone else had done that who doesn't have a keen interest in serving the market, we'd all have been looking around as to what to do. So that's a misinterpretation on the gun drilling side. We continue to serve customers in that space. Obviously, there's a cost of doing business in any environment, especially when you make significant investments. We've expanded the capacity in that facility since we acquired it. Everyone can have access to that as well without any restrictions. And then we actually acquired another business to increase the capacity that we needed to make that service available to folks in the space. That's a similar reaction that we got, I think, ultimately with the ATI deal we did on the melting. There was this reaction that we might have been doing it for some nefarious reason. We did it frankly and simply to ensure that the capacity needed, the melting capacity across all those unit operations, not just the melt furnaces, but everywhere, would have the availability to have the volume and the increased capacity needed to serve the market. So.
You know, I was wondering, kind of backing up to the supply, you know, the integrated capabilities. Sure. I was wondering if you also kind of on the back end talked about laser processing. Do you also laser process in-house?
Yeah, Steve, actually, I would tell you, NDC and Confluent started out as a component supplier and a laser as-cut producer for purposes of our own use. We don't contract out laser cut.
Okay,
we
gotcha.
do laser cutting for our own component use and our own component sales.
Okay.
We do allow folks access to our melting capacity. Obviously, we do allow folks access to our gun drilling capacity, and we do allow access to our hollows and wire capacity. So if people want to buy wire from us, or people want to buy hollows from us, we'll happily sell those activities in. But we typically keep our laser processing for our own use internally. Okay.
For your own delivery systems in-house. Yeah, that makes sense.
For our own implants and frames, et cetera.
Gotcha.
That's what it's there for. There's other folks in the space that do contract laser processing. We're not a contract laser processor.
Okay.
Dean, do you see the sophistication just accelerating in regards to either processes or use cases, especially on the nitinol side or material side in general with your expertise?
We do actually, and I hate to keep going back to the same place, Steve, but Joe, but I will. We have been looking at the nitinol usage in the market now, obviously for the last 11 years and prior, and it looks like the use of nitinol materials is roughly doubling every 5 years, roughly. So the good news is that there's now available capacity that we've been able to put in place to support that. But that was also one of the major drivers. It wasn't just the stabilization, but it was also the ability to actually put capital and resources in place to handle that roughly doubling of demand that we're seeing. If you don't mind, I'll just revisit a point I made earlier. If you have a company that you're sourcing, a wonderful partner, by the way, who's melting and converting 2 billion pounds of nitinol of materials, for other uses outside of medical, and you approach them and want them to double their nitinol medical capacity where you're selling 150,000 pounds, they look at you a little funny about, do you really think that's where we're able to put our capital? And as a result of that significant demand, the capabilities nitinol brings to the device market and the increased use of that material, it wasn't only stabilizing nitinol and having it available, it was also having a place where the capacity could be doubled and or tripled to ensure that future generations of products can be supported, not only for launch, but for the inevitable growth that they experience once they're in the field.
And then what are you keeping your eyes on? Obviously, the organization's got, like a lot of its peers, some solid vision about what's going to happen over the next 5 to 10 years as you look at devices and you look at trends.
Sure.
Do you see additional opportunities and potential gaps in any other supply chain areas without playing your hand out outright?
Yeah, well, I think we're fortunate enough that most of the major unit operations and capacities that are necessary, we've now got sort of under some level of management and influence. That's really quite important. I think we're spending some time, obviously, looking at improving some of the purity levels that folks are wanting, purer and purer, smaller and smaller devices. So that will inherently require higher purity materials for fatigue resistance and other things. So we are looking and doing some work in that area, with not going too far into it, obviously. We've also, as you can imagine, I think one of the things we think an awful lot about. It's one thing to have all those capabilities, but it's another to actually have access to being able to influence them, so our customers have shorter lead. Everybody wants shorter lead times, lower costs, smaller devices. I mean, if you went down the list of our strategic customers and said, what are the top 3 or 4 things we should be thinking about? Price, lead times, size, price, lead time, size, right? I mean, given quality and other things, obviously, are necessary to even receive that phone call. So, what I would suggest that, we're spending time is actually systems to integrate and allow our customers to have access to the components or intermediate materials that are necessary for their devices, so they can get them quicker at a lower cost, and obviously the quality levels they require and the purity levels they require. It's one of the things we've seen of late is there's a lot of anecdotal information in the field that says, oh, there's plenty of capacity in melting, or plenty of capacity in gun drilling. There's plenty of capacity in tube drawing. All those things are true, by the way. Whereas with an integrated, contained supply chain, similar to what we've been able to create with our work, we're able to turn those intermediate materials around in 10 to 12 weeks, which is unheard of, actually. Space. Obviously, they have to be processed into a component, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not implying that you can get a component from the time you place a phone call in 12 weeks, unless it's a qualified product that's already processed. But you get the point, right? It's one thing to have all those capacities sparingly spread out in the world, and depending on other suppliers for them. It's quite another to be able to pick up the phone and say, hey, Joe, I need a tube, or I need a component. And you say, yeah, I can get you that because I've already got the metal in place. I've got the intermediates in place. I've got tubing in place or wire in place. I've got capacity online. Yes, I can react to your request and not have to give you a 1.5 year long lead time.
So let me unpack that, because that scared the bejesus out of me for a second.
It'll teach you to eat better. Got to keep the ticker.
So if I've got a device, a class 3 device on the drawing board, and it's got a nitinol infrastructure to it, one way or another, and it's something that is relatively unique, or rather than me paint the story, give me that story.
If you want a test part, if you call our company tomorrow and wanted a prototype done, we can usually do that in 10 to 15-ish days or something. So that's different. It's 1 or 2 or 10 off, where if you've got a product that you've got in the market and you see a doubling of need for that product that's in the market. So I don't know, something happens, you get qualified somewhere else, or there's some report or whatever, something comes out where somebody goes, Joe, I need 1.5 or 2 times the capacity from you starting next Tuesday. Well, unless you have access to metal, gun drilling capacity, tube drawing capacity, wire drawing capacity, et cetera, you are now cascading that demand request all the way back through to somebody ordering nickel and titanium. I mean, I'm being overly sort of critical, but you get the point, right? Yeah. So if you're in a position where you've got capacity you need to double or triple quickly, and you don't have that relationship with that supply chain in place, where you've got intermediate hold points, you got access to metal available, et cetera, the standard lead time from a phone call to get an ingot itself, just the ingot, is roughly 52 weeks.
Wow.
And that has to still be converted into a billet, ground tested, drawn. I mean, go down the list, right? I could do that for hours. And the other thing that's interesting, again, I'm just real life examples, right? Is folks will call and say, well, wait a second. You've got 150,000 pounds of metal. I know you sold 50,000 here, 20,000. People have access to that. Why can't I have some of that? Well, because once we convert it into something and supply it to the industry, it might be in bar form, it might be in tube form, or water form. I have no idea what happens to it once they take that bar, tube, or billet. They might allocate it all to one customer. And I mean, I have no idea how they handle that. So when we get it, we're able to allocate materials to customers and applications that are deemed critical. We can obviously put influence on that. We have the supply chain capabilities on the melt side to get more melted and converted, and we've got hold points and inventory. So we've taken sort of that unknown out of the picture. You call our number, we're able to kind of cascade it through to ourselves rather than calling somewhere and having them cascade it through multiple different stops, hoping that there's capacity available, and more importantly, hoping that there's excess capacity available unplanned. Because if not, you're just stealing capacity from somebody else.
Wow. Well, that's fascinating to me. And I knew nitinol played such a critical role in most of the devices that we see coming out today on the active or even inactive class 3s, but that just blows my mind.
Sure. Yeah, we spent a lot of sleepless nights worrying about that. So I think from our team, the one thing I tell our team that we should be very proud of, and we try to be a very humble organization. I want us to be very proud of the fact that we took steps many months or years ago to ensure that we got to a place where we could take this risk or anxiety. By the way, not that others maybe have or haven't. I'm not trying to imply that somebody else isn't doing these things, but I do know if I get a phone call to any of our facilities and they want a nitinol component or material or hollow or wire, I know I can commit to a delivery to them based on my own supply chain capabilities, and they will know that's going to happen because I don't have to deal with anything outside of my four walls to create that.
Well, job really well done, and I appreciate you sharing that story with us. I think when people watch this, they'll just go, holy cow, I did not realize that. So, it's the backbone to the industry. As I always say, the contract manufacturing world is the engine to everything else.
Yeah, the one thing I always encourage folks is if they have a chance to watch this is maybe less about what I say or what we talk about. I mean, I hope they do enjoy it and they gain something from it. But I hope that what it triggers in them is to say, you know what, I'm gonna be on the airplane flight that Dean was on with my napkin and my pen. And I'm gonna draw the boxes out and say, oh, wow, okay, I don't even know what this is or what that, or maybe they do, but if they do, fantastic. If they don't, the best thing I think we can do is educate folks to not take anecdotal information about capacity or availability or problem solved or not solved, and just say, look, I'm going to investigate. I know I need X amount of pounds of metal in my devices. I know this is where it comes from. How does it get there? And who's getting it there? And if they educate themselves on that, whether it's us or otherwise, I think we've done the industry a huge service.
Awesome.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, boys and girls, you have your homework.
Very
Dean,
good.
We appreciate your time, man. I know you're very busy.
No
thank you
worries.
for sharing the story and a little bit of history with Steve and I.
No, we appreciate it. I will tell you, I've known Steve, at least his name and stuff, for a long time, and I was flattered that you reached out and allowed us the chance to spend time with you too. I think what you all are doing is incredible in educating and updating the team, and I really do appreciate you allowing me a few minutes to spend time with you. We're not very passionate about it, as you can probably tell.
Yeah.
Thank goodness. Thank goodness.
So anyway, thanks so much, guys. I appreciate you taking the time, and if you ever need anything else, obviously reach out. We'll happily spend time with you all. So,
Thanks, Dean.
Thanks, Steve.
Appreciate it. See you guys.
Thanks, Dean.
Bye.
I'm Joe Mullings, 160 Studios. Be well.